Chapter 15. The whine of descending countergrav units took Laurencio Esteban by surprise. He turned and stepped out of the cavernous, empty maintenance shed which normally housed the SCM's Wolverines and frowned. Wiping his hands on grease-spotted cloth, he watched the shuttle touch down. He had spent most of last night and several hours this morning helping Consuelo Gonzalez, maintenance chief, wrestle with one bulky Wolverine's main traversing gear. But he'd switched the field approach comm circuit through to the maintenance shed. If that pilot had called ahead for clearance, Esteban would have heard him. The old man ambled across the ceramicrete as the unannounced arrival powered down its engines. It was a standard civilian ship-to-shore shuttle, without hyper capability, but it carried Navy markings, and 4 men in a familiar uniform walked down the ramp as he approached. He shoved his cleaning cloth into a back pocket and held out a hand. "Morning, gents. Can I help you? Mr. Esteban?" The man who spoke wore a colonel's uniform. He was perspiring heavily, though the morning wasn't actually all that warm, not for Santa Cruz at least, and his palm was as wet as Esteban nodded and shook his hand. "I'm Colonel Sanders, Dinochrome Brigade. This is Major Atwell, and these two gentlemen are Lieutenant Gaskins and Lieutenant Deng." "Nice to meet you." "Something wrong with your comm, Colonel? I beg your pardon?" "I asked if you had comm problems. I didn't hear no landing hail over the approach circuit. Santa Cruz ain't much, but if your ship's got a comm glitch, be happy to see what my electronics shop can do to help." Sanders' eyes slid towards Major Atwell for just an instant, then he gave himself a little shake and smiled. "Sorry, Mr. Esteban. We didn't mean to violate field procedure, but since Captain Merritt's dispatches started coming in, Central's realized the actual situation out here. We know you've got responsibilities of your own on your own hacienda, and we weren't sure if you'd be at the field this early. If you weren't, we didn't want you to go to the bother of coming out just to greet us." "Mighty thoughtful, but 'tisn't a problem. My place just over the hill there. I can pop down for 4 or 5 minutes max by air car. Anyway, now you're here, what can I do for you?" "Actually, Mr. Esteban, we're here to see Captain Merritt. Could you direct us to the Bolo depot and perhaps provide transportation?" Esteban began to explain that Paul was in the middle of a field exercise, then paused, mental antennae quivering as Sanders' eye curtsied towards Atwell again. The old man couldn't have said exactly why, but that eye movement seemed furtive somehow. And why should a full colonel be, or seem to be, so worried over what a major thought? Something odd was going on. His mind flickered back to overpast conversations with Paul Merritt. Laurencio Esteban hadn't lived 70 years without learning to recognize when someone watched his words carefully. And he'd accepted months ago that Paul was up to something he didn't really want anyone else to know about. That might have worried him, if he hadn't also decided Paul was a man to be trusted. More than that, the younger man had become a friend, someone Esteban both liked and respected, and the sudden, unannounced arrival of 4 officers of the Dinochrome Brigade looked rather ominous. If his friend was in some sort of trouble, Laurencio Esteban intended to give him as much warning and buy him as much time as he could before it descended upon him. "And tell you what, Colonel, I've been working on some maintenance problem this morning. Probably take me a little while to scare up something with the kind of bush capability you gon' need. Why don't you and your friends come on over to admin with me? I'll get cleaned up, then I see what I can do for you. How's that?" Sanders glanced at his chrono, and a brief spasm seemed to flash across his face. Then he made himself smile. "Of course, Mr. Esteban. Thank you. Our business with the captain is a bit on the urgent side, however. If you could expedite our transport?" "No problem, Colonel. We'll get you on your way right smart." Esteban turned to lean the way to the admin building, and the 4 officers fell in behind. He led them inside and waved to the chairs in the spacious waiting room Santa Cruz hadn't needed in living memory. "Have a seat, Colonel. Be with you as soon as I wash off some of this grease." He nodded to his guests and ambled down the hall to the washroom. None of the visitors knew it had a rear door, and he grinned to himself as he kept right on going towards the comm room. Paul Merritt reclined in the Depot Command Center's comfortable chair as he smiled and watched the planetary surveillance display. He wished he were riding with Nike instead of keeping track of her through the satellite net, but the purpose of the exercise was to show what his girl could do in independent mode. Besides, he had a better view of things from here. In an effort to give the militia at least some chance, he and Colonel Gonzalez had agreed to isolate Nike from the recon satellites for the first portion of the exercise. That, coupled with complete comm silence from the depot, would both deprive her of bird's-eye intelligence and force her to execute all of her own planning, strategic as well as tactical. Since that was something the Mark 23 wasn't supposed to be able to do, her ability to pull it off would underscore her talents for the performance log. In the meantime, however, the understrength battalion of 500-ton Wolverines had been snorting through the jungle for several hours, moving into position. and Nike didn't know where they were precisely or what they planned. She knew their objective was to reach the depot without being intercepted, yet the way they did it was up to them, and Gonzalez had opted for a multi-pronged advance. She divided her 14 Wolverines into 4 separate forces, 2 of 3 tanks each and 2 of 4 each, operating along a same general axis but advancing across a front of almost 50 kilometers. There was a limit to even how rapidly a Bolo could move through Santa Cruz's jungle, and the colonel clearly hoped to sneak at least one force past Nike while the Bolo dealt with the others. If she could get a big enough head start once contact was made, it might even work. Splitting her tanks into detachments really wouldn't increase the odds against their survival. All 14 Wolverines together wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes against Nike in a stand-up fight, but Nike would have to deal with the separated forces one at a time. It was certainly possible, if not exactly likely, that one of them could outrun her while she swatted its fellows, and a signal beeped. He twitched upright in his chair. It beeped again, and he turned to his chair to face the communications console. The screen flickered to life with Lorenzo Esteban's face, and Merritt frowned as he recognized the old man's tense expression. "Morning, Lorenzo. What can I do for you?" "I think maybe you got a problem here at the field, Paul." Merritt's left eyebrow rose, and the old man shrugged. "I got me 4 Dinochrome Brigade officers out here, headed by a colonel named Sanders, and they here looking for you, boy." "Sanders?" Merritt let his chair snap upright and frowned as an icy chill ran through him. "Clifton Sanders?" "That's him." Esteban nodded, and Merritt's lips shaped a silent curse. He could only think of one thing that would bring out the sector's chief maintenance, logistics, and procurement officer to Santa Cruz. But how in the hell had anyone on Ursula figured out? He shook himself and his mind raced. He could call off the exercise and order Nike back to base. But there was no regulation against a Bolo commander on an independent assignment conducting exercises on his own authority. More to the point, having Nike out of the garage when Sanders arrived would buy at least a little time. That might not be as important as he suddenly feared it might be. But the fact that Sanders had come in person, without sending even a single information request first, and hadn't calmed him back from the field after arrival, was either more than simply ominous. It smacked of sneak inspections, an attempt to catching Merritt violating procedure, and unfortunately, that was exactly what he was going to do, because Merritt hadn't kept Central fully informed of the state of his command as regs required. He might not have told any actual lies, but he'd certainly done a lot of misleading by omission. He closed his eyes and thought hard. Sanders himself had a reputation as an administrator, not a technician. He might not realize how far outside of parameters Nike was, from a cursory examination of her schematics and system specs. But that was probably why he'd brought the others along. Any half-competent Bolo tech would know exactly what he was seeing the moment he pulled up Nike's readouts. Besides, Sanders wouldn't be here in the first place if he didn't already suspect something was out of kilter. A fist of cold iron squeezed Merritt's heart at what that might mean. But if Nike wasn't here when the MLP men arrived, they'd have to at least talk to him before they could shut her down. In fact, he could force them to hear him out by refusing to call her in until they did. It wouldn't hurt if she'd completed the first phase of the exercise either. Thin as it might be, his performance log's authentication of her unique abilities was her only real protection. Of course, if he refused to call her in when ordered, especially after what had happened on Sandlot, he was through in the brigade. But he suddenly realized how little that meant to him besides protecting Nike's life. He opened his eyes and cleared his throat. "Thanks, Lorenzo. Thanks a lot, buddy." "Son, I don't know what y'all been up to out there, and I rightly don't care. You're a friend. You want I should let these yahoos get themselves lost in the bush? I reckon it'd take them 4 or 5 hours to find you with the directions I can give them." "No, I appreciate the offer, but you better stay out of this one." "Huh. Well, how about I waste an hour or so before I find them transport? I already set that one up." "If you can do it without being obvious, please do. After that, though, you'd better get home and keep it far away from any official involvement as you can." "If you say so, boy. Gotta tell you, Paul, they say something squirrely going on here. Can't put my finger on it, but I can feel it. You watch yourself, here?" "I will. Thanks again." Merritt nodded to the pickup and killed the circuit, then leaned back and fidgeted in his chair. He started to key his link to Nike, then sat back and put his hands in his lap. There was no point in worrying her, and she was just as likely to argue if he told her he wanted her to stay out of sight. He shook his head. "No, much better to leave her in blissful ignorance as long as possible." "I sure hope to hell your associates have managed to deal with that Bolo, Mr. Scully," Colonel Granger muttered. "Amen," someone muttered across from the recesses of the big transport CIC, and Jolt Osterwald shrugged. "You've seen the plan, Colonel." I can't blame you for worrying, but I certainly wouldn't be here if I didn't expect it to work. I can believe that, the colonel muttered to herself, and turned away from the glowing tactical display. The single aspect of the plan she disliked was the tight timing. They were scheduled to hit the planet within 2 hours of Colonel Sanders' arrival, and she hadn't liked it one bit. It would take less than 15 minutes for an air car to reach maintenance depot from the field, and Sanders could burn the Bolos command center in less than 10 once he got it shut down. So if all went according to schedule, 2 hours was ample cushion. But if things didn't go as scheduled, they got there too soon. Before the Bolo went down, and its commander, she clenched her teeth and commanded herself to stop worrying over what she couldn't change. Besides, Scully was right in at least one respect. The Bolo commander, this Captain Merritt, had to be among the fatalities. Because if he wasn't, the fact that someone had fixed the Bolo would be glaringly evident. But the same thing would be true if anyone on the planet happened to calm Central, or anyone else off planet, and casually mentioned the presence of Dinochrome Brigade officers on Santa Cruz at the same moment as a pirate raid just happened to hit it. They had to take out the planet's ComSat relays in the opening gambit of their attack. Anyway, because if there was so much as a single Navy destroyer anywhere within jump range of Santa Cruz, and a message got out, it could blow all 3 of Matichuk's Marauders' starships to scrap. And since they did have to take out Santa Cruz's FTL communications, they might as well do it as quickly as possible after Santa's arrival to ensure no word of his presence ever got out. Besides, they didn't know how thoroughly Merritt had settled in on Santa Cruz, or how much contact he normally had with the locals. If he had friends who knew he was going to be visited by an off-world deputation, they might as well calm him to find out how things had gone. And when they didn't get an answer, or if they figured out he was dead, they were almost certain to calm Central. All of which made it highly desirable to hit the planet as soon as possible after Sanders did his dirty work. She understood that, but she still didn't like the timing. The smart move, as she told Scully, or whatever the hell his real name was, and Matichuk repeatedly, would be to wait until Sanders shut the Bolo down and was able to confirm his success. Unfortunately, Scully was the one calling the shots, and Matichuk wasn't about to argue with him. Well, at least they had confirmation that Sanders had arrived on schedule, courtesy of the ship which carried him. And as Scully had pointed out, there were 2 strings to the colonel's bow. If this Captain Merritt argued with him, all was needed was for Captain Merritt to die a little sooner than was scheduled. With him dead, Sanders, as the senior brigade officer on Santa Cruz, would become the Bolo's legal commander. His access at Sector Central had given him the command authorization phrase he needed to so identify himself to the Bolo. And it was only a Mark 23. It wouldn't be bright enough to ask any difficult questions when he ordered it to shut down. Not that it would matter. With the command phrase in his possession, Sanders could lobotomize the damn thing even if it proved unresponsive. Granger bared her teeth at the tactical console. She'd read Merritt's record. The man was smart, gutsy, tough, and as good as they came. But it didn't matter how good he was. He knew who Sanders was, so he wouldn't be suspicious of the colonel, and he had absolutely no reason to suspect the other brigade members, with his superior, were professional killers. If he proved difficult, it would be a very brief difficulty. "Assault orbit in 96 minutes, ma'am," her ops officer murmured, and she nodded. "Double-check the fire solution on the ComSats. All 3 of those birds have to go down the instant we enter orbit." "I'm on it." The ops officer grunted ionically, and Louise Granger sat back in her command chair with an evil smile.